Greetings, my dear viewer. This is a channel about marital infidelity and about the consequences if one spouse starts to cheat on the other. If you, as well as I do, support true family values and condemn cheating, then subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. Let's get started. There's something intrinsic to my nature that likely explains it. Perhaps it's the guilt instilled in me as a child by my parents, a tool they used to keep me on the right path. Or maybe it's simply how I'm built. Whatever the cause, even as a child, I'd occasionally wake in the dead of night, haunted by vivid dreams where I was guilty of some terrible act. The worst part wasn't the crime itself. It was the looming inevitability of being found out. In these dreams, the weight of guilt pressed heavily on me, coupled with an unshakable certainty that proof of my misdeed existed and that I would be exposed. The nightmares would jolt me awake, my heart pounding furiously as I sat upright in bed, struggling to find peace again. Oddly enough, those dreams stopped entirely when I met my wife. She was everything I didn't know I needed, warm, loving, and full of laughter. She had a way of giggling at even my weakest jokes and won my mother over effortlessly the first time they met. We were married for 12 years. The first few years were good, great even. But after the birth of our first child, a daughter, things started to shift. The change was gradual at first, so faint I barely noticed. Yet, as time passed, it became impossible to ignore. When our son was born 2 years later, her transformation seemed complete. With each year that followed, the distance between us grew. Bitterness took root, and her once gentle nature hardened into something sharp and cold. She began lashing out, her tone harsh and cutting, even with the children. Motherhood, it seemed, was not a role she fully embraced. I tried to talk to her, to understand and fix what had gone wrong, but every attempt ended the same way. Arguments. Arguments she often sparked out of thin air. Eventually, I stopped trying. The divide between us became an unspoken truth, and we fell into separate parallel lives. If someone were to ask me what I had done to warrant such treatment, I wouldn't have an answer. It wasn't anything I had done. She simply seemed perpetually dissatisfied. With me, with the children, with her life. As the kids grew older, her desire to escape the house became more pronounced. Her outings became frequent and routine. Most evenings, I would come home from work just as she was heading out the door. "Dinner's on you tonight," she'd say casually. "I'm going out." At first, her words cut deeply, but over time, I began to see them as a reprieve. The nights she was away brought a calm to the house, a quiet that felt like peace. Oddly enough, it was the nights she stayed home that I started to dread. I took over the household duties, cooking, grocery shopping, and meal planning. I became the one who managed the day-to-day needs of the home. Naturally, my children began to gravitate toward me. Over time, I became both their father and, in many ways, their mother. While this brought us closer, it left me with a deep bitterness. A father isn't meant to be both parents. He should be the one greeted with joy at the door, knowing his children are thriving under the warmth and care of their mother. But in our home, things were different. When I walked through the door, the kids would come out of their rooms, eager to spend time with me, but they avoided their mother entirely. The woman I once knew, the one I had fallen in love with, was unrecognizable. Her own upbringing was a warning she had ignored. Her mother had been unfaithful, making infidelity almost a way of life. My wife had witnessed the devastation it caused her father, how he had endured a hollow marriage for the sake of his children, suffering in silence until they left for college. Only then did he leave. My wife had vowed she would never repeat her mother's mistakes, but even that promise, it seemed, was one she had broken. The beginning of the end came on an ordinary night. The children were asleep when she walked into the living room and uttered the words no husband wants to hear. "Michael, we need to talk." Her voice was cold, almost clinical, and she didn't soften the blow. Without hesitation, she told me she had a lover and would be spending her nights with him. The revelation wasn't a surprise. I'd suspected as much for a while. Strangely, I felt no pain or betrayal, only relief. Her absence, like her outings, would make life easier for everyone. At first, she seemed triumphant, almost smug at my lack of reaction, but as she turned to leave, I thought I caught a flicker of disappointment in her expression. Did she want to hurt me? Was she hoping I'd beg her to stay? If so, she misunderstood. To me, the woman I had married no longer existed. I stayed for the sake of the children, just as her father had. That became my sole focus. In the months that followed, we settled into a strange, detached rhythm. My wife's absences went unnoticed by the children, who never even asked where she was. It was as if they, too, felt the relief of her departure. Spring arrived, and with it, the usual chores of the season. One Saturday, the kids and I spent the day cleaning every inch of the house, dusting, polishing, and airing it out. Without her presence, the house felt lighter. That evening, we celebrated our efforts with burgers and root beer floats. The weeks that followed were busy. I tackled home improvement projects, repainting, fixing shutters, and repairing parts of the house that had been neglected. My children helped where they could, and together, we turned the house into a home for the three of us. Some tasks, however, were beyond me. Every spring, I hired professionals to handle the septic tank, a dirty but necessary job. One Friday evening, with the kids staying at their grandparents' house, I returned home with takeout, expecting solitude. Instead, I found my wife sitting in the living room with her latest lover. They were drinking my best scotch, laughing as though they owned the place. She announced that her new partner would be staying the weekend, sleeping in our bed. With a smirk, she suggested I could watch if I wanted, laughing at her own cruel joke. Her lover, emboldened by her audacity, took my dinner and slapped me as he walked past to head upstairs. That slap shattered something inside me. As their mocking laughter echoed through the house, I began to prepare. The garage held everything I needed: plastic sheets, old rags, and tools. Quietly, methodically, I planned my next move. That night, as they reveled in their cruelty, I reached the breaking point. I tore through the soil, exposing the septic tank below. The clock had already ticked well past midnight when round 3 commenced. Their obnoxiously exaggerated moans masked the sounds of my movements perfectly. Grasping the bat that leaned by the doorway, I tested a few overhead swings, ensuring I wouldn't strike the ceiling by mistake. Satisfied with the motion, I ascended the stairs and proceeded down the hallway toward her bedroom. Without hesitation, I brought the bat crashing down on his head, the force propelling it into hers with a sickening collision. He collapsed immediately, his body going limp. The sounds she made shifted from indulgence to terror. A second swing ended her screams abruptly. By sheer fortune, their skulls remained intact. Neither shattered under the blows. They simply lay unconscious. Wasting no time, I restrained their wrists and ankles with zip ties, ensuring they couldn't resist. Not that they stirred during the process. Their oblivion was complete. There was no undoing this now. One by one, I carried them outside. He went first. Hoisting him over the gaping tank, I ended his existence before releasing his lifeless body into the dark abyss. The sound that followed was a muffled thud rather than a splash. Next came her turn. For a fleeting moment, memories of our life together invaded my thoughts. Our courtship, the romantic dates, the proposal, and those vows exchanged before family and God. But the past didn't matter now. I did what was necessary, consigning her to the same grim fate as him. To eliminate any evidence, I discarded the knife into the tank as well, unwilling to gamble on cleaning it to perfection. After sealing the lid, I covered it with soil and meticulously replaced the grass so that no trace of the disturbance remained. Unsure whether my shirt carried any telltale stains, I tossed it into the backyard fire pit and watched it burn to ash. I washed myself thoroughly, scrubbing my skin raw and changing into fresh clothes. Once cleaned up, I armed myself with a flashlight and methodically examined every inch of the bedroom, hallway, and stairs for any stray evidence. Weeks later, the thought of the shovel I'd used, its role in the grim task, would surface unexpectedly. It's always the small details you overlook. Sure enough, I found blood on its wooden handle. I burned that part to ash and sterilized the steel blade with bleach before discarding it at the local dump. As dawn approached, one final task remained. Taking his car keys, I drove his vehicle to a rough neighborhood on the other side of town. Parking it inconspicuously, I began the long trek home. Along the way, I dropped the keys into separate sewer drains, scattering them one by one, starting about a mile from where the car was abandoned. The night was quiet and dark, and I blended into the shadows, just another figure lost in the void of the city streets. When the sun rose, I double-checked the house. I couldn't believe my luck. If their skulls had fractured, cleaning would have been nearly impossible. Thankfully, the plastic sheeting I had prepared wasn't needed. That Sunday evening, my parents returned with the kids just in time for dinner. I made cheeseburgers and root beer floats, a simple, comforting meal for all 5 of us. My mother, noticing my cheerful demeanor, remarked on it. I casually replied, "It was a relaxing weekend. Now my sweethearts are home." When she asked about my wife's whereabouts, I shrugged. "No clue," I said, "and honestly, I don't care." That seemed to satisfy her curiosity. On Monday, I took a sick day and began systematically disposing of her belongings. I delivered her clothes to several Goodwill drop-offs scattered across nearby towns. Her makeup found its way to the public landfill, buried within a bag of household trash. Her jewelry, though harder to part with, also had to go. It was too risky to keep. Most of it had lost its sentimental value anyway, reminders of gifts she never deserved and her countless betrayals. I figured it would take a day or two before her employer realized she was missing. When they finally called, I claimed ignorance, feigning concern. Then I filed a missing persons report, crafting a believable story about her repeated infidelities. I told the officers I assumed she had run off with her latest lover. When asked why I hadn't reported her absence sooner, I delivered a carefully rehearsed explanation. I didn't worry, because I was used to her disappearing acts. I only became concerned after her employer contacted me. When they inquired about her lover's identity, I feigned disgust. "Do you really think I'd want to know?" I replied, channeling just the right amount of disdain. I painted myself as a patient father who had made peace with her double life long ago, focusing instead on raising my children. I even claimed I'd planned to divorce her once they were older. The detectives seemed satisfied with my account. A couple of weeks later, they informed me their theory was that she had eloped with her lover. "Good riddance," I muttered with a shrug. As they walked out, I added with a smirk, "If you find her, give me a heads up." They laughed and never came back. That was 5 years ago. Since then, life has been nothing short of perfect. After a year, I filed for divorce on the grounds of abandonment. The kids occasionally brought up their mother, but quickly adjusted to her absence without much emotional turmoil. Not a single tear was shed. I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel a pang of anxiety every time the septic tank gets emptied. Still, the knowledge that their remains continue to decompose in the depths brings me a peculiar sense of closure. I'm especially grateful they were unclothed when I disposed of them. No risk of fabric clogging the pump. Explaining that scenario would have been complicated. Unless, of course, the driver shared my marital history. And now, if you'll excuse me, I have to use the bathroom. Never has the simplicity of flushing felt so satisfying. Each flush reminds me of my gift, traveling through the pipes to rest eternally alongside my unfaithful wife and her final mistake. My friend, and this is the end of the story. If you liked this story, then put your royal like and subscribe to the channel. May the force be with you.